All right. Well, now I'm going to try to tell you about 15 years of research in like 15 minutes. So thanks for being here. I really quickly want to point out like our fantastic team that Sherry was talking about. None of this research would have been possible without them. And so I won't list them by name, but they're here and you'll see all their names on the following papers. Essentially, one of the tools that we're looking at evaluating is using heritage genetics for sort of sustainable beef production, as Sherry sort of mentioned. And so one of our prevailing hypotheses is that these heritage genetics have been well adapted to the southwestern hot environments over long periods of time. For those of you who don't know, we're talking about Criollo cattle. And so Criollo are derived from heritage breeds that came across from Andalusia in southern Spain, basically in the late 1400s, early 1500s. And so they've been living in sort of isolated pockets throughout the Americas for about 500 years. And the particular group that we're interested in is from the southern part of Copper Canyon, sort of at the end of the Villalobos area there. And that's a particularly harsh, hot, arid environment in the northern part of the United States, or in the southern part of the United States, or North America, excuse me. And we think that they have adapted to that environment and have a lot of rustic traits that could potentially help us sort of mitigate and adapt to climate change challenges. In addition to sort of finding an animal that has potentially a lighter environmental footprint on the landscape. And so we thought about this in terms of their physiology. So we have a paper specifically about like their shape and size. When we compared the Raramuri, which are sort of in the middle here, for folks in the audience, they are sort of a medium stature compared to their Mexican counterparts. So there's other biotypes from Mexico that sort of fall on the left side of this figure. And then there's larger types from South America and also North America on the eastern part of, or on the right side of the figure. So those include like the Florida Cracker, Texas Longhorns, some that you might be sort of more familiar with. And basically what we think happened is through natural selection, basically like the Texas Longhorns were able to get larger frame sizes because of access to increased nutrition, especially on the Great Plains where there's all sorts of grass, or where there was all sorts of grass, versus these cows who were living in this much harsher terrain, sort of needing to subsist on shrubs and with very little human inputs, no selective breeding practices, no artificial insemination, anything like that. And so that's sort of driving our hypothesis. And then we got really into the behavior work because this is sort of the thing, this is the connection between the animal's sort of livelihood and then its interaction with the environment. And so this study by Panetti and others from 2011 evaluated desert adapted Angus versus our Raramuri Criollo cows. And what you can see is in the spring when the vegetation is sort of similar, both breeds are sort of doing the same thing. But the big takeaway from this study was that in the fall, when the soils and the vegetation are most vulnerable, the Criollo are sort of using the entirety of the pasture. And this is like a 2,000 hectare pasture versus the Angus, which are much more concentrated to a lower area of the pasture, sort of using about half of the landscape. And so this sort of sparked our hypothesis to really think that there might be this lighter environmental footprint, both because the cows are smaller than sort of your typical traditional breeds, but also because of these divergent behaviors. So in a follow-up study, Namuri Kunge and others this year evaluated a similar thing, but this was a crossover study. So in that first study, cows were run together. In this study, cows were separated. And so every 2 weeks, they switched the pastures that the Angus or the Criollo were in. And we basically saw the exact same trends. In the summer there, you can see both breeds are sort of biotypes are sort of converging on similar forages. And the big takeaway here, and these maps are maybe a little deceiving because they're ivlev selectivity analysis. So they're really looking at like the likelihood or not of the animals being in a particular place. But here again, you see basically the same trend where the Herefords are sort of concentrated in particular areas of the pasture and the Criollo are using bigger areas of the pasture and different ecosystem or ecotones compared to their beef breed. In another study by Dr. Spiegel and others from 2019, they did a similar analysis looking at the behavior of both biotypes across different green-up periods. So here they're using NDVI to evaluate the greenness of the pasture. And in this particular instance, you see again the same trends. So in the pre-green up period and the green up period, they're kind of doing the same thing. And then in the drier periods, for instance, the dry down, the last figure in the bottom, you can see that the Angus are sort of converging closely onto the greenest areas of the pasture. And again, the Criollo are spreading out. And here they also evaluated the number of visits or revisits. And so the red dots in the plot are actually showing revisitation rates. And so here again, you see that the Angus Hereford actually revisited the same areas significantly more than the Criollos. So we're calling those hot spots. And we think that that's also potentially quite detrimental to the landscape because these conventional breeds could potentially be sort of overusing areas of the grass that we don't want them to. In another study, Namiri Kunge and others fairly recently evaluated the effects of having a calf by your side versus being so a lactating cow versus dry cow behavior. And here what we saw at the Renata Experimental Range and Rancho Tesiachi in Chihuahua is basically that the calves do have an effect on the mother. And this is partly because the calves are with the mother at all times. So one of the primary findings here is that the Criollo tend to exhibit a follower behavior pattern as opposed to a hider mothering behavior style. And so what happens is with the followers, obviously the calf is basically with the mother at all times versus in other livestock and other breeds where the calf is either hidden in a bush or sort of left with a babysitter cow for the day. And that can also hinder the way that cows behave. So in another follow-up study, Namiri Kunge and others looked at the effects of young calves on their mother's behavior for both Criollo and more traditional but desert adapted Angus. And here again, you see basically the same behavior pattern that we've seen throughout the other studies. The Angus are quite constrained in their abilities to move, particularly because of the calves versus the Criollo, which basically don't have that same spatial constraint because their calf is with them at all times. So what's happening here is the Angus, and we've seen this in some other studies, do exhibit that sort of hiding behavior where they're leaving their calf with maybe a guard cow or a babysitter cow, we call her. And then they sort of stay in the bush and she goes out to forage for the day and then we'll actually come back at a couple different intervals during the daytime to be able to nurse. And so this is another example of sort of the beneficial behaviors that we think the Criollo exhibit compared to the conventional breeds. So they're doing different things sort of throughout their physiological life cycle. In another study, Namiri Kunge and others looked at the effects of summer and winter temperatures, ambient temperatures on the internal body temperatures of the Criollo and the Angus. And what you can see here is there was no difference in the winter, but in the top graph, as the day, this is across daylight hours, so there's 4 periods: dawn, pre, noon, and dusk. And basically, as the day got hotter, the heat load within the Angus internally was significantly greater than that of the Criollo. So the Criollo were basically maintaining a lower internal temperature throughout the day compared to their Angus counterparts, which we think also is beneficial, right? Because they are not constrained by being overloaded in heat. They're not needing to change their behavior to go seek shade or shelter or drink more water or just rest. And this is also potentially due to some of those physiological traits that I talked about earlier. So we found in our herd, only about 15% were sort of solid black animals. So, there might be some sort of genetic traits like coat color or coat length that are sort of contributing to these findings. We are also interested in the grass-fed sort of components here and the viability of using these animals as like beef animals too. So in another study, we looked at the behavior of Criollo versus Criollo beef breed crossbreds. And basically I put this ton of maps up there to show you that there wasn't any significant difference between the behavior. So we thought that basically you can raise Criollo purebred or Criollo beef crossbreds on rangeland to marketable weights. Here you can see the crossbred Brangus Criollo, and they were about 475 kilograms. So 1,100 pounds, which is sort of typical for our grass-fed market. And these these steers were finished at about 30 months. And one of the reasons we're interested in this as well, and I should have prefaced, is that Criollo producers are sometimes docked when they're going to the sale yard because the calves are smaller. And so they're kind of forced into this, production system where they need to finish them on grass and sort of market to niche markets. And Sherry spoke to that, and Sky will be talking about that in a little bit. But that sort of brings me into some preliminary conclusions, and I'll follow up with some of the stuff that we're working on to address those other issues. So we think that the Raramuri criollo have these heritage rustic genetics that basically they've adapted over 500 years with minimal human interactions and contact, and they could be well suited to sort of these emerging climate trends, particularly because of their ability to interact with this harsh environment, exert a lighter environmental footprint compared to their beef breed counterparts. And basically we could provide producers with a novel resource, a novel tool, which really isn't that novel considering they're 500 years old and have their roots in the arid part of southern Andalusia, but for sort of adapting to climate change or also managing for sort of ecological objectives. And of course, that's been a big topic at SRM this week. Sherry and others have produced this paper sort of outlining the goals of our project. And one thing I want to mention is that we are also interested in sort of the ecological effects. And so for those of us who track cows using GPSs, we know that it's really difficult. We're saying that they have a lighter environmental footprint because they're lighter and they're not impacting the forages, et cetera. But we need to get on the ground and collect the vegetation data as well to look at that relationship. And that sometimes doesn't happen in our GPS studies. So we set up a long-term, this is part of the USDA ARIS's long-term agricultural research project, or LTAR network. And so these pastures have been studied for nearly 50 years, and now we've stratified these two biotypes over top of the pastures. So we'll be tracking them almost continuously with the GPSs, and then also collecting veg data at on an interannual basis to be able to see, over the next 20 years, if there's actually differences in the way that the animals are interacting with the landscape and also affecting the landscape. Another part of the project that Sherry spoke about was we are crossbreeding the Raramuri criollos with beef breed bulls. And so we're interested in seeing what those calves look like when they go into a more standard production system. So here's some very preliminary data with some Red Angus and some Red Angus criollo crossbreds. And basically what we saw this year is that the crossbreds actually performed a little bit better in the feedlot system. They gained a little bit higher, and everything, they just got slaughtered like a few weeks ago, but everything is basically, market ready at 18 to 24 months, which fits into the normal system. And these calves are kind of grading within the standard, not the standard system, but not standard necessarily, not the beef grade standard. So I think I have a couple minutes for questions, but yeah, thank you.
What's your feed conversion on that per pound?